Hi everyone, it's Brittany. I'm going to share a few things that I found salient about this week's readings. One common theme I noticed in this week's readings is race or racism. So I'm mostly going to talk about race as it relates to education, maybe more K through 12 than higher ed, just because this was how these chapters were written. Although I will share how it relates to education in general and when I can, how it relates to my work in higher education. These readings were informative, and for the purposes of the discussion, I'm going to discuss two of the chapters from the louder text. First, a little bit of a summary and what resonated with me from chapter 37. Democracy, Education, and Multiculturalism, Dilemmas of Citizenship in a Global World. So this chapter explains how theories of multiculturalism are connected to the politics of culture and education, and that the dilemmas of citizenship in a democratic, diverse, multicultural society include the fact that theories of citizenship have been advanced in the tradition of Western political theory by heterosexual white males and women, certain religious groups, working class people, specific ethnic and racial groups, and people lacking certain skills such as literacy were excluded from the definition of citizens in numerous societies. Theories of multiculturalism are effective in discussing the politics of culture and identity. They're insightful in showing the remarkable complexity of multiple identities, and the theories of multiculturalism are unable to embrace a theory of citizenship and a theory of democracy that could be workable in practical, procedural terms, ethically viable in moral terms, and politically feasible in the context of capitalist civil societies, according to Lauder. The authors in the book discuss that we need a theory of multicultural democratic citizenship that will take serious the need to develop a theory of democracy that will help eliminate the inequalities and inequities in capitalist societies, and a theory of democracy able to address the tensions between democracy and capitalism on one hand and among social, political, and economic democratic forms on the other hand. According to Marshall, the most significant development in citizenship theory in this century has been linking the welfare state and its network of services with the full expression of democratic citizenship. Western civil society obtained civil rights in the 18th century, political rights in the 19th century, and societal rights in the 20th century. And civil rights are rights such as the right to own property, freedom of speech, and the right to justice, whereas political rights are the right to vote, to elect, and to be elected. And social rights are the most controversial, and they include what is necessary for individuals to live a full life, and the right to education falls underneath social rights. This evolution of civil rights in the 18th century, political in the 19th, and social rights in the 20th has been criticized as only being applicable to white English working males because the theory of citizenship left out race and ethnicity. An article I read discussed Marshall's theory, and it questions that if every citizen is equal before the law and should therefore be able to choose who makes law, shouldn't every citizen also be equipped, knowledgeable, and secure enough to enjoy his or her civil and political rights and fulfill the responsibilities that come with them? And if yes, then decent education and living conditions must be aspects of citizenship. I don't want to debate or discuss socialism necessarily, but in today's society, I have to agree that in order for all individuals to be able to fully live life and enjoy all social rights, they should have access to higher education. And first of all, putting like the financial aspects of higher ed aside, I think higher education in the U.S. allows everyone opportunities, or not everyone, but more, and even gives second chances to students who didn't do well in high school through open access colleges or community colleges. And paying for college is a different story. As one of three kids raised by a single mom who was probably making about upper 40,000 when I graduated high school. Scholarships or loans or working my way through college were my only options. So thankfully, as a Georgia resident, I got the Hope Scholarship, and I think more states need to offer these types of scholarships, whether lottery funded or tax dollar funded. Additionally, I think higher education needs to stop or reduce the steady increase in tuition. Augusta University, where I work, had a 5.5% increase in tuition this year, and that's not the worst. The University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Middle Georgia State University, and Atlanta Metropolitan State College each had a 9% increase, and there was a 8.3 tuition increase at Georgia Gwinnett College. Okay, so race and racism are central concepts in understanding the U.S. Racial formation, and they are perceived by critical race theorists as muted and marginalized in the analysis of public policy and citizenship. Critical race theory began in the U.S. with legal studies attempting to address the differential treatment of colored people by the justice system and in prisons. And this chapter discusses Derek Bell, who is skeptical regarding civil rights achievements in the U.S. and says that policies such as Brown versus Board of Education, which found that separate schools for blacks and whites to be unconstitutional, did more to advance the nation's foreign policy than actually provide aid to blacks. And critical race theorists believe that racism is so deeply ingrained in the U.S. that we need to consider changing citizenship to incorporate systematic challenges to the practice of racism in the legal system and the school system. These challenges or reorganization should think about the logic of property rights over the logic of personal rights and the foundation of human rights as the basis for equality and justice. The authors state a distinctive characteristic of new social movements is their cognitive and ideological focus on rethinking pre-existing social and cultural paradigms as part of politics of identity. Consequently, one of their key strategies to broadly educational as opposed to a focus on gaining power and its implications for citizenship are numerous. I liked one example that the text included. So if you think about the impact of the anti-tobacco movement in schools that challenged the notions of the glamour of smoking and linking advertisements to the powerful tobacco lobby and multinational tobacco companies. And by challenging the consumption of tobacco, all sorts of connections between the political system, the mode of production, and the risk to the quality of life of the citizens are critically exposed. So social movements typically build on the knowledge base and previous struggles of people while taking into account their organizational capabilities and grievances, and this allows for the building of programs with and from the communities rather than for them. In summary, I thought this chapter did a good job of explaining and criticizing theories of citizenship and discussing how the U.S. has a long way to go to fix the racism that is ingrained in the individuals in our country. So next I'm going to talk about what resonated with me from chapter 39, which was Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. In 1991, social activist and education critic Jonathan Kozol defined the great inequities that exist between the schooling experiences of white middle-class students and those of poor African American and Latino students. This chapter talks about how the inequities or inequalities that still exist are allowed as the result of a racialized society in which discussions of race and racism continue to be muted or marginalized. Toni Morrison, who won a Nobel Prize in Literature, summarized the race as a factor in equity well when she said, "Race has become metaphorical, a way of referring to and disguising forces, events, classes, and expressions of social decay and economic division, far more threatening to the body politic than biological race ever was. Expensively kept, economically unsound, a spurious and useless political asset in election campaigns, racism is as healthy today as it was during the Enlightenment. It seems that it has a utility far beyond economy, beyond the sequestering of classes from one another, and has assumed a metaphorical life so completely embedded in daily discourse that it is perhaps more necessary and more on display than ever before. Rather than the decline of racism, we have witnessed an increase. And although Toni Morrison argues that race has become metaphorical, it's important to note the ways in which race, whether cultural or biological, acts as this figurative expression or perception. And so even when race fails to make sense in a situation, we continue to use it. This point reminded me of Crystal's presentation in our cognitive issues class last weekend. And we are quick to judge and make assumptions based on what we see in our society, especially leaders in higher education and education in general need to get away from these assumptions. So, question is, if race doesn't exist scientifically as a biological concept, why is race still a powerful social construct and signifier? Omi and Wanat, I don't know if I'm saying that right, talk about a racial formation theory that they define as the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. It's a process of historically situated projects in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. In other words, racial formation theory is the framework used to analyze race as it is today in our society in the U.S. The chapter discusses that by arguing that race is untheorized, we are not suggesting that race hasn't been studied carefully as a powerful tool for explaining social inequity, but that the intellectual salience of this theorizing has not been systematically used in the analysis of education inequality. So like Omi and Wanat, we are trying to understand the social structure and cultural significance of race in education. Woodson and Du Bois used race as a theoretical lens for assessing social inequality, even though at the time the mainstream academic community marginalized their work. This chapter also discussed gender inequalities in education. Although females receive better grades than males, these grades do not translate into more or better college admissions or in the workplace. Without getting into too much detail, I have to say I definitely see this in the workplace. We must all realize that race continues to be significant in explaining inequities in education, particularly K through 12 education. Class and gender do not explain all of the educational achievement differences that exist, so it's obvious that race continues to be an issue and a significant in explaining the inequity in education in the U.S. For example, even when you take into account class and gender, we can't explain the high rates of high school dropout or suspension or failure, etc., that happen among African American and Latino males. Which brings me to my next point from this chapter, and that is critical race theory in education. Although some argue that poor children do worse in school regardless of their race, the book argues that the cause of their poverty, along with the condition of their schools, is structural racism or societal racism. The book argues that despite the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision that African American students are more segregated than ever before. The academic achievement of African Americans and Latinos has failed to improve while their suspension, expulsion, and dropout rates have continued to increase. These points are interesting to me because the area that I live in is a prime example of this happening. So in Richmond County, where Augusta is located, blacks make up over 50% of the population, and 26% of people are living in poverty in Richmond County. Almost 84% of people 25 and over graduated from high school, and 20% hold a bachelor's degree or higher. And then you look at Columbia County, which is the suburbs of Augusta and include better schools. And 17% of the population in Columbia County is black, for 50% in Richmond County West. Only 9.5% are living in poverty, 26% Richmond County were. And 91% of people 25 and over graduated high school, with compared to 84% in Richmond County, so not terribly lower. And 34% hold a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 20% in Richmond County. This data is all from the U.S. Census Bureau of 2015. So everyone in my area knows that the Columbia County Public Schools provide a better education than Richmond County Public Schools. And those that live in Richmond County, or I should say the majority of those that live in Richmond County that can afford to send their kids to private schools, do. I wish I could find the percentage of students graduating only from public schools, because I think it would show a better reality rather than comparing the 84% to the 91%. So in summary, I thought this chapter did a good job of explaining how the education of white middle-class individuals is much different than the education that the majority of blacks and Latinos receive in the U.S. These inequalities are the result of a racialized society in which discussions of race and racism continue to be muted and marginalized. So that's what I wanted to talk about for the week. See you all in a couple weeks. Bye.